On the chilly evening of November 3, 1963, the small town of Billings, Montana, was bathed in the orange glow of street lamps reflecting off frost-covered sidewalk. Evelyn Carter, 14, had been walking home from her friend's house carrying a worn satchel stuffed with books and notes. The streets were unusually empty, the crisp air carrying faint echoes of distant trains and barking dogs. Witnesses later remembered a dark station wagon parked at the corner of 7th Avenue and Main Street, engine idling low, windows fogged. By the next morning, Evelyn had vanished without a trace, leaving behind her coat on a nearby park bench and a single shoe near the curb. Her disappearance triggered a frantic response from local law enforcement. Officers combed the neighborhood, knocking on doors and checking alleyways, but no immediate clues emerged. Evelyn's parents, Margaret and Thomas Carter, were distraught, organizing volunteers to search fields and riverbanks even as the first snowflakes began to fall. Reporters arrived, documenting every tear and desperate plea, turning the small town into a temporary epicenter of anxiety. But beneath the surface of apparent diligence, hidden hands were already manipulating events, and the machinery of corruption was quietly shielding truth. Billings, at the time, was a city caught between rugged small-town values and growing industrial influence. Organized crime had infiltrated several key sectors: shipping, logging, and even city contracts, all under the protective wings of local officials. Evelyn's disappearance, unknown to her family, would soon intersect with, revealing a dark web of influence, greed. The threads that led to her vanishing were already tangled in decades of early investigation missteps created confusion. Police interviewed a traveling salesman reported near the Carter residence, but he left town immediately after the disappearance. Other tips suggested a runaway, a cult, or even family dispute, but all leads fizzled. Crucial evidence, footprints, neighborhood camera footage, witness statements, was either lost or deliberately altered. Forensic logs mysteriously appeared, while dispatch tapes recorded gaps that no one could explain. It became increasingly clear Evelyn's case was being actively suppressed. Even before formal investigation began, subtle signs of tampering were evident. Neighbors reported officers arriving late or turning away at critical moments. One local dispatcher later admitted she was instructed to erase certain calls from the log, ones that mentioned a suspicious vehicle near Evelyn's room. Investigators would eventually uncover that these orders came from a city official with ties to Montana's criminal underworld. Every attempt to document evidence was carefully controlled, and each misdirection left the family and investigators frustrated and powerless. Weeks turned into months. The Carter family's grief deepened, amplified by the public's attention fading as newspapers moved to her story. Yet Margaret Carter never accepted the idea that her daughter had simply disappeared. Each unanswered question became a burning reminder that forces beyond the family's control had silenced the truth. Behind the closed doors of City Hall, syndicate allies and insureds remained dormant, a secret contained suspense. By the late 1960s, Evelyn's disappearance had grown into a cold. Local police maintained routine checks, but privately acknowledged that corruption within their ranks had stymied the investigation from day one. Anonymous tipsters had left misleading clues. Letters claiming Evelyn had been seen in neighboring states, rumors of her joining a traveling circuit, all proved false. While the family and community clung to hope, federal investigators began noticing discrepancies in patrol records and dispatch logs from November 3, 1963, revealing strange gaps coinciding with the time of her disappearance. A quiet federal task force assembled in the 1980s began reviewing Montana's unsolved child abduction. Their attention quickly centered on Evelyn Carter, particularly after discovering altered police logs and misfiled reports. Certain officers who claimed to have been patrolling Main Street were nowhere near the area, according to early traffic camera records, which had been re-examined with modern technology. Additionally, navigation data from patrol vehicles, long thought unreliable in the 1960s, was digitized and analyzed, revealing patterns that suggested deliberate misdirection. Retired officials later confirmed that city leaders had deliberately protected a local crime syndicate to which Evelyn's disappearance was connected. Officers were bribed or intimidated, evidence was destroyed, key witnesses were quietly relocated. One former police sergeant admitted to being told to turn a blind eye to suspicious vehicles and individuals near the Carter home. The FBI realized that the disappearance was not just a tragic accident, but a deliberate act orchestrated by men powerful enough to manipulate law enforcement and municipal records. False leads planted to confuse the investigation plagued the case for decades. Anonymous letters, fabricated photographs, and even fake sightings in other towns diverted attention from the real events. Local law enforcement consistently pursued these distractions, unknowingly or deliberately covering the trail that led directly to Evelyn. Federal investigators, armed with modern technology and archival reconstructions, slowly began unraveling decades of deception and obstruction. By the 1990s, the task force focused on the Montana crime syndicate, identifying a network of men involved in abduction, illegal trafficking, and violent intimidation. Evelyn's abduction appeared to be a targeted punishment for an individual connected to her family who had resisted the syndicate's operation. Though the original investigation had been sabotaged, each recovered fragment of evidence, altered logs, missing camera footage, and corroborated witness memories added clarity to a case that had remained frozen in time. Despite the decades of delays, the Carter family never gave up hope. Margaret Carter maintained the search publicly and privately, visiting archives, attending hearings, and petitioning authorities. Her persistence ensured the case remained active at the federal level, even as local officials tried to let it fade into oblivion. This quiet, relentless determination became a lifeline for the investigation, setting the stage for a breakthrough that would finally reveal the truth behind Evelyn Carter's death. By 2000, nearly 4 decades after Evelyn Carter vanished, the federal task force had painstakingly reconstructed the night of her disappearance. Modern forensic tools allowed them to re-examine old evidence. Traffic camera fragments, weathered fingerprints, and tampered dispatch logs revealed that a black 1962 Chevrolet station wagon had loitered near Main Street at 7:15 p.m., precisely when Evelyn was last seen. Further analysis of navigation data from patrol vehicles that had been missing in official records showed suspicious routes and unexplained stops near abandoned warehouses on the edge of Billings. These discoveries indicated the involvement of an organized crime network operating with impunity. The syndicate, it appeared, had infiltrated local government and law enforcement from the very beginning. Certain officers had falsified patrol logs, removed reports from filings, and even intimidated neighbors who witnessed the suspicious station. An internal whistleblower revealed that city council members had received payments to ensure no property records or permits could be traced back to syndicate operation, effectively erasing evidence of warehouses and hideouts. Every false lead Evelyn's investigators had chased over the years now revealed itself as a deliberate red herring. To investigate further, the FBI obtained satellite imagery from the 1980s, alongside property records, and reconstructed blueprints of abandoned warehouses along the Stone River. These locations, once considered irrelevant, now seemed central to the abduction. Agents used ground-penetrating radar to scan beneath concrete floors and old storage yards, discovering evidence of disturbed soil consistent with clandestine burial or hiding sites. Each technical clue supported the growing theory. Evelyn's disappearance was orchestrated by a syndicate with deep local connection, and the cover-up had been ongoing for decades. At the same time, surveillance and informants identified a key syndicate figure who had survived into the 2000s, Robert Bobby Langston, a low-level enforcer responsible for couriering abducted individuals and transporting evidence. Langston had maintained a low profile for decades, but occasional financial transactions and sporadic movements suggested he held the key to uncovering what truly happened. Agents began covert operations to track his movements, monitoring his correspondence, cell phone usage, and travel patterns, all while maintaining complete secrecy to avoid tipping off remaining syndicate allies. Months of surveillance revealed that Langston frequently met with other retired syndicate members in rural Montana, in locations that had once been warehouses or hideouts. Agents noticed unusual behavior, encrypted messages, hidden packages, and the deliberate avoidance of known police checkpoints. Each observation reinforced the suspicion that he retained detailed knowledge of Evelyn Carter's abduction and the subsequent cover-up, including who had assisted him within law enforcement. The FBI knew that bringing Langston in could finally break the decades-long silence. By the end of 2001, the task force formulated a strategy: isolate Langston, capture him in a controlled environment, and leverage evidence to compel cooperation. For the first time, investigators felt a glimmer of hope that the decades of frustration, false leads, and bureaucratic interference might finally yield results. Evelyn's case, once a cold file collecting dust, was now on the verge of revealing the truth, a truth that would expose a criminal organization, corrupt officials, and the full horror of what had happened to a young girl on that fateful night in 1960. The operation to capture Robert Bobby Langston was painstakingly planned over several months. The FBI knew that a direct approach could provoke violence or cause him to vanish entirely, so they devised a strategy to lure him to a location where federal agents could maintain complete control. The team selected an abandoned warehouse along the Yellowstone River, a site historically tied to syndicate operations, but now safely isolated. Every detail was rehearsed. Surveillance drones hovered discreetly above, unmarked vehicles monitored access roads, and undercover agents posed as intermediaries, offering access to long-frozen syndicate funds. On the evening of April 14, 2002, Langston arrived at the designated warehouse in a nondescript sedan, accompanied by two men who appeared to be longtime associates. Inside, the warehouse smelled of mildew and rust, dim light casting long shadows across stacked crates. Agents, concealed behind crates and vehicles, observed his behavior. Langston appeared cautious, scanning exits and checking for surveillance. When the supposed intermediaries presented envelopes with fictitious financial documents, he signaled his men to move forward, unwittingly stepping into a controlled trap. At a precise moment, the tactical team activated lights and executed a synchronized entry. Langston's associates were disarmed within seconds, restrained without injury, and cuffed as agents secured the perimeter. Langston himself froze, shock and realization crossing his face as he was handcuffed and read his rights. No shots were fired. The operation was a textbook execution of precision planning. For the first time since 1963, a member of the criminal organization directly involved in Evelyn Carter's disappearance was in federal custody. Langston was transported immediately to a secure facility, isolated from any potential syndicate interference. At first, he feigned ignorance, denying any involvement in Evelyn's abduction and claiming he had no knowledge of her fate. However, the FBI had an arsenal of evidence: old property records, tampered police logs, surveillance from the warehouse capture, and reconstructed navigation data from patrol vehicles on the night of November 3, 1963. Every lie he told was systematically dismantled with incontrovertible proof. The breakthrough came when Langston realized the syndicate could no longer protect him. Remaining loyalists were either deceased or imprisoned, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. Federal agents offered a choice: cooperate fully in exchange for federal protection, or face prosecution with little chance of survival should syndicate remnants retaliate. Exhausted by decades of guilt and aware of the mortal risk, Langston agreed to tell everything he knew, setting the stage for a full revelation of the night Evelyn Carter disappeared and the decades-long cover-up. Langston's cooperation opened the floodgates of truth. Federal investigators now had the opportunity to finally reconstruct what had happened on November 3, 1963, down to the smallest chilling detail. They could trace the abduction, identify the criminal actor, and understand how corrupt officials had shielded the syndicate from scrutiny. After nearly 40 years of frustration, the case was finally moving toward a resolution that promised both justice and long-overdue closure. In the sterile confines of the federal interrogation, Langston's demeanor shifted from defiance to haunted resignation. Sitting alone, with a recorder capturing every word, he began recounting the events of November 3, 1963, with chilling clarity. He described how Evelyn Carter, walking home from her friend's house, had been spotted by a syndicate scout driving a black station wagon. The target was chosen not at random, Evelyn's father, a small-time accountant, had inadvertently uncovered illicit financial dealings linked to the syndicate's Montana op. The abduction was intended as a warning, but what followed spiraled into cruelty beyond Langston's initial apprehension. Langston admitted that he and 2 associates had intercepted Evelyn near the corner of 7th and Main Street. She had been startled, attempting to flee, but was quickly restrained and guided into the car. He described her muffled cries and terror in her watch, the details so vivid they made even veteran agents shiver. The vehicle was then driven to an abandoned warehouse of Billings, where Frank the Fox Marino, the syndicate leader, awaited. Langston confessed that the warehouse had been prepared to hold Evelyn temporarily, complete with restraints and basic provisions intended until further instruction arrived. According to Langston, the syndicate's plan was to leverage Evelyn as a bargaining chip against her father, demanding his cooperation in silencing certain financial records and preventing federal audits. However, complications arose when law enforcement scrutiny increased unexpectedly after an unrelated investigation near the warehouse. Fearing exposure, Frank ordered Evelyn moved to a more secure location, a secluded farmhouse owned by a corrupt deputy who had long been a syndicate accomplice. Langston reluctantly followed the order, aware that any misstep could result in severe punishment or death. Langston recounted the grim final moments at the farmhouse. Evelyn was kept in a locked cellar for several weeks, during which she was isolated. Attempts to negotiate with her father failed, and impatience grew within the syndicate. One stormy night, under explicit orders from Frank Marino, Evelyn was suffocated to prevent any potential evidence from surfacing. Langston admitted his guilt openly, describing how he had been forced to participate under threat of lethal reprisal. Her body was then concealed beneath the basement floor, hidden under fresh concrete. The confession revealed the meticulous cover-up orchestrated by the syndicate and its corrupt allies. Police logs had been altered to show patrol officers far from the scene, surveillance cameras deliberately disabled or removed, and dispatch tapes erased. Payments were made to city officials to maintain the facade of procedural normality. Even decades later, these falsifications had ensured the case remained unsolved. Langston's testimony detailed how carefully the syndicate manipulated both evidence and narrative to mislead investigators, a deception that spanned more than 40 years. Finally, Langston provided the exact location of the farmhouse and the burial site beneath its basement floor. He drew a detailed map marking every entry point, every hidden room, and the path Evelyn had been forced to traverse. His testimony, cruel in its clarity, allowed investigators to prepare for the recovery operation and eventual arrest of syndicate members and complicit officials. For the first time, the federal team had a complete picture of the abduction, murder, and decades-long obstruction, setting the stage for justice and closure. The recovery operation began in the early hours of May 7, 2002, under heavy federal oversight. Forensic teams equipped with ground-penetrating radar, cameras, and excavation tools surrounded the isolated farmhouse in rural Montana, now vacant and overgrown with weeds. Every step was carefully planned to avoid alerting any remaining syndicate affiliates who might have learned of Langston's cooperation. Agents moved silent, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as drones hovered above, transmitting live feeds back to the command center. The weight of decades of unanswered questions pressed down on every. As the team drilled into the basement floor, layers of concrete and soil were methodically removed. Technicians documented every fragment with meticulous care. Traces of binding material, fragments of clothing, and soil disturbed in patterns consistent with clandestine concealment. When the first remnants of human remains emerged, a hush fell across the team. Small bones, discolored by time but unmistakably human, were carefully lifted, bagged, and sent for DNA analysis. The forensic team worked with painstaking attention, aware that these remains were the missing pieces that had haunted Montana for 39 years. Within hours, the full extent of the crime became horrifyingly clear. Additional remains surfaced, revealing that Evelyn's body had been meticulously hidden beneath the basement floor, just as Langston had described. The fragments of her belongings, partially decomposed, confirmed her identity. A worn satchel, a torn notebook, and a single shoe matched photographs and descriptions from her family. Technical evidence, combined with Langston's detailed maps and testimony, left no room for doubt. The federal team had finally located the remains of a girl who had disappeared over 4 decades. The investigation confirmed the syndicate's involvement beyond the basement. Forensic examination revealed remnants of plastic coverings, soil displacement consistent with heavy equipment, and materials indicating attempts to mask decomposition odors. DNA testing later verified the remains as Evelyn Carter, conclusively ending years of speculation. Investigators cataloged every piece of evidence, ensuring that each step could withstand legal scrutiny. Photographs and measurements were taken of the disturbed floorboards, concrete layers, and the precise placement of the remains. Every detail would become critical in the upcoming trials. News of the discovery sent shockwaves through Billings. Local authorities, long complicit or negligent, faced intense scrutiny. The Carter family, now in their 70s, was notified. The revelation of Evelyn's burial site offered both closure and renewed grief. Margaret Carter now wept openly as agents recounted the pain's discovery, while Thomas, stoic yet visibly shaken, struggled to process decades of anger, hope. For the first time, the family could acknowledge the truth. Evelyn had been found, but only after decades of obstruction and corruption. The successful recovery set the stage for a series of high-profile arrests. With Langston's cooperation and the forensic confirmation of Evelyn's remains, federal authorities now had the evidence necessary to bring syndicate leaders and corrupt officials to justice. The operation demonstrated not only the capabilities of modern investigative techniques, but also the importance of persistence over decades of bureaucratic and criminal interference. While the recovery brought tangible closure, the emotional scars and the lingering shadow of corruption left an unmistakable mark on the agents, the community, and the Carter family. Following the recovery of Evelyn Carter's remains, federal authorities launched a coordinated campaign to apprehend the remaining syndicate leaders and their corrupt allies. Arrest warrants were executed in Billings, Missoula, and Helena, Montana, targeting individuals whose decades-long protection of the syndicate had allowed Evelyn's disappearance to remain a mystery. Among those apprehended were Frank the Fox Marino, the syndicate's longtime ringleader, and Harold Jenks, the retired deputy who had provided the farmhouse as the hiding place. The operation meticulously planned simultaneous raids to prevent any chance of escape or destruction of evidence. The arrests were dramatic. Marino, aged and wary, was taken from a heavily guarded home without incident, though his associates attempted to interfere. Jenks, once a respected officer, was handcuffed in his living room, staring in disbelief as agents recounted the decades of obstruction and complicity. Federal prosecutors emphasized that these men were being held accountable not only for Evelyn Carter's murder, but also for the systematic cover-up that had misled generations. Every confiscated ledger, altered log, and tampered dispatch tape strengthened the case against them. Evidence gathered during the operation painted a damning picture of the syndicate's reach. Financial records revealed illicit payments to city officials, judges, and law enforcement officers who had deliberately suppressed information. Tampered surveillance footage and falsified patrol logs confirmed that corruption had permeated Montana's justice system, creating a protective shield for organized crime. Agents meticulously cataloged every document, photograph, and artifact recovered from syndicate-controlled properties to ensure airtight prosecution. During the arrests, local media converged, capturing every moment and broadcasting the downfall of men who had long operated above the law. Public reaction ranged from shock to outrage, as decades of rumors and suspicions were confirmed in real time. The Carter family, present in Billings, watched from a distance, experiencing a mixture of relief and grief. For them, decades of unanswered questions were finally being confronted, yet the personal cost, the stolen childhood of Evelyn, the years of false hope, remained painfully evident. Langston's cooperation proved pivotal in securing indictments and convictions. His testimony detailed the abduction, the syndicate's internal communications, and the involvement of corrupt officials, leaving juries with an unambiguous account of the crimes. Technical evidence, including concrete samples in the farmhouse basement, soil analysis, and DNA verification of Evelyn's remains, corroborated every aspect of his confession. The prosecutors emphasized that the system's failures were deliberate, orchestrated to protect a criminal enterprise rather than serve justice. Despite the arrests, investigators remained wary of lingering threats. Younger syndicate members, not yet indicted, still held influence in certain industries, and some officials with indirect ties were yet to face scrutiny. The FBI knew that while significant progress had been made, the fight against organized crime, systemic corruption, was far from over. Yet, for the Carter family and the agents who had devoted decades to the case, these arrests represented a monumental step toward justice and the long-overdue resolution of Evelyn Carter's disappearance. The trials of Frank Marino, Harold Jenks, and the remaining syndicate members began in early 2003, drawing national attention to the decades-old. Courtrooms in Billings and Helena were packed with journalists, family members, and citizens eager to witness the reckoning. Prosecutors meticulously presented evidence, tampered logs, altered dispatch, financial ledgers, and, most importantly, Langston's full confession detailing Evelyn Carter's abduction, captivity, and murder. The narrative left jurors stunned as the systemic corruption behind the disappearance laid bare. Langston testified under heavy protection, recounting the abduction with painful honesty. He described the chilling fear in Evelyn's eyes, the brutal enforcement of syndicate orders, and the careful measures taken to conceal the crime. His voice trembled as he explained how local officials were bribed and intimidated to destroy evidence and mislead investigators. Every word painted a vivid, cruelly precise picture of what had transpired on the night of November 3, 1963, finally exposing the truth that had eluded authorities for more than 39 years. The defense attempted to discredit Langston, portraying him as a desperate liar seeking leniency. They argued that forensic evidence had degraded over time and that eyewitness testimony. Yet the technical data, ground-penetrating radar scan, concrete sample, soil analysis, and DNA verification of Evelyn's remains overwhelmed their claim. Cross-referenced with Langston's detailed maps and recollections, the evidence left jurors with no reasonable. Each piece of tampered record, each falsified log, became a testament to the decades of deliberate obstruction by the syndicate and its allies. Verdicts were delivered over several days, culminating in life sentences without parole for Marino and Jenks. Lesser members received varied terms, while corrupt officials, including retired city council members and law enforcement officers, were convicted of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and aiding a criminal enterprise. The court emphasized that these sentences were not only for Evelyn Carter's murder, but for the decades-long betrayal of public trust, demonstrating that crimes hidden for years could not escape accountability indefinitely. The Carter family, present throughout the proceedings, experienced a mixture of relief and sorrow. Margaret Carter wept openly as the gavel fell, while Thomas Carter clutched her hand, silent tears betraying years of suppressed grief. The family finally had answers, names, and a measure of justice. But the cost, decades of fear, uncertainty, and lost time, remained impossible to measure. Their reunion with the truth was bittersweet. Evelyn's absence could never be undone, but the acknowledgement of what had happened offered some measure of closure. For the investigators, the trials provided both triumph and exhaustion. Agents who had labored for years to piece together decades-old evidence felt a profound sense of accomplishment, yet the haunting images of the recovered remains and the cruel details of the crime lingered. Langston's cooperation had been essential, but even he faced the weight of his role in the tragedy. The trials closed a chapter in Montana's criminal history, but the emotional and psychological scars on the family, the investigators, and even the community remained, a sober reminder of the cost of corruption and the endurance of truth. On June 15, 2003, the Carter family held a private memorial for Evelyn in a quiet cemetery outside Billings. The day was overcast, with a faint wind rustling autumn leaves, creating an atmosphere that mirrored both grief and relief. Margaret and Thomas Carter placed a small bouquet on the freshly prepared grave, alongside a worn satchel, a single shoe, remnants that had survived decades and symbolized their daughter's lost childhood. Though long-awaited answers had arrived, the act of burial brought a visceral finality, forcing the family to confront the depth of their loss. The ceremony was attended by immediate family, close friends, and select members of the investigation who had labored for decades. Agents, usually stoic, strained, showed rare emotion as they observed the Carter family pay tribute. The investigators understood that while justice had been served in court, no verdict could restore the life stolen from Evelyn or erase the decades of uncertainty endured by them. Their presence served as both support and acknowledgment of the resilience of a family that had endured nearly 40 years of anguish. The community of Billings responded with a mixture of sorrow and reflection. Longtime neighbors recounted memories of the night Evelyn vanished, the whisper of organized crime, and the frustration of law enforcement misdirect. Local officials, some retired and some still in office, faced scrutiny for past complicity. Public forums discussed the failures that had allowed corruption to shield the syndicate for decades, highlighting the necessity of systemic reform. For the town, Evelyn's burial marked the end of a chapter, but also a painful reminder of vulnerability and betrayal. For Langston, who remained under federal protection, the burial invoked a complex mixture of relief and guilt. His testimony had brought truth to light, secured convictions, and facilitated the recovery of Evelyn's remains. Yet he carried the burden of his role in the abduction and murder, understanding that cooperation offered no absolution. He remained isolated, living under a new identity, forever marked by the memories of a girl he could not save and the decades-long secrecy that had defined his life. Investigators reflected on the painstaking process that had finally yielded resolution. The combined use of forensic technology, archival reconstruction, and Langston's cooperation had overturned decades of obstruction and false leads. Yet even with technical mastery and legal triumph, they recognized that closure was partial. The emotional scars, both personal and communal, could not be erased. The victory of justice was tempered by the persistent shadow of what had been lost, and the stark realization that corruption had enabled cruelty on a scale previously unimaginable. As the Carter family left the cemetery, the sky began to clear, casting gentle sunlight on the graveside. There was a quiet dignity in the moment, a mixture of mourning, relief, and reverence for Evelyn's memory. The case, officially closed in the courts, remained an enduring lesson. Truth, no matter how long concealed, could eventually be revealed, but the echoes of tragedy would persist. In Billings, Montana, the story of Evelyn Carter would forever linger as a symbol of resilience, the price of corruption, and the bittersweet nature of justice finally served. Years passed after the trials and the burial of Evelyn Carter, yet the echoes of her disappearance continued to shape the lives of everyone involved. The Carter family, now older and weathered by decades of grief, tried to rebuild their lives with the fragile peace that justice had provided. Margaret Carter maintained a quiet advocacy for missing children, speaking at events and sharing her story to prevent others from suffering similar losses. Thomas Carter, though more withdrawn, found solace in preserving Evelyn's memory through photographs, letters, and journals recovered during the investigation. Their lives were forever marked by tragedy, yet defined also resilient. Federal agents involved in the case carried the weight of decades-long labor and strain. Many had retired, but the memory of the discovery, recovery operation, and the trials remained vivid. Langston's cooperation had been pivotal, yet his role in the crime left an indelible mark on those who had interrogated. For the investigators, the case exemplified the duality of justice, triumph over criminal networks, and corruption, tempered by the haunting reality of irreversible law. The lessons learned became part of training programs, case studies, and cautionary tales for law enforcement nationwide. The syndicate itself had been dismantled, its leadership imprisoned, and corrupt officials exposed. Yet remnants persisted, subtly influencing business dealings and local. Investigators acknowledged that while Evelyn's case had been resolved, organized crime and corruption could never be eradicated. Montana's law enforcement agencies were restructured, and oversight mechanisms were strengthened, but the shadow of past misdeeds lingered. The case served as a reminder that vigilance must be ongoing, and that justice delayed, even decades, still has consequences and responsibilities. For the Carter family, closure was bittersweet. They had answered, but they could never reclaim the years stolen from Evelyn or the innocence lost from their own lives. Each anniversary of her disappearance brought reflection, grief, and remembrance. Friends and neighbors, some of whom had doubted, remained in awe of the family's resilience and determination. The town of Billings had changed, yet the memory of the abduction and the corrupt protection it received remained embedded in local consciousness, a silent warning of the fragility of trust and the danger of hidden power. Despite the convictions, some questions lingered. Investigators feared that additional victims might never be found, that other crimes linked to the syndicate had remained undiscovered, and that some accomplices had evaded justice entirely. Langston, living under federal protection, carried the knowledge of other misdeeds he had witnessed, a burden he could not share. The haunting realization was clear. While Evelyn's case had reached resolution, darkness still lingered in corners of Montana that law enforcement could not fully illuminate. In the end, the story of Evelyn Carter served as a testament to perseverance, pursuit of truth, and the resilience of a family facing unimaginable cruelty. The grave site remained a place of mourning and remembrance, visited quietly by those who knew the story. Justice had been delivered in court, remains recovered, and corrupt networks dismantled. Yet the story retained an air of lingering a reminder that even after decades, some wounds never. For Billings, Montana, and for all who had fought for Evelyn, the past remained a shadow, a whisper of innocence lost, and a cautionary tale about the cost of secrecy, corruption, and time. If you stayed with us until the very end, thank you for listening to this story of mystery, tragedy, and the relentless. Stories like Evelyn Carter's remind us how important it is to never stop seeking the truth, no matter how long. If this story moved you, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss our upcoming videos filled with emotional, gripping stories, unexpected twists, and moments that touch the heart.